please remember that when things get rough, you can always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm Shirikiana Garima, and on behalf of Sankofa Video Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to our event this evening. As usual, when we work with the Hurston Wright Foundation, we're in a position to introduce a very special guest. And tonight is no different. The foundation has made it possible for us to talk to writers and access material that they are very good at accessing. The foundation does events with writers in progress when they're working on books before they're finished. They also train writers in the craft, and then they work with writers after the books are completed to expose them and even market their materials. So we're really very honored to work with the Hurston Wright Foundation. And the person representing that foundation and conducting our conversation tonight is Marita Golden. She's a writer, novelist in her own right that we're very proud to have as part of the Washington, D.C. community. And I will let her introduce our special guest, Miss Aaliyah Bundles, a writer, author, also in this area. And please give a warm round of applause for both of our guests today.
Thank you, Shirikiana. Tonight's program is the second in a series that we're calling First Draft Backstory. And as someone who's very familiar with the diversity of the writing community here in Washington, and because so many of these people are my friends, I got very interested in the whole process of writing. And I thought it'd be really cool to have some conversations with writers before their books were finished, to talk about research, interviewing, inception, completion, because that's a whole journey that is very interesting in itself for readers, as well as for people who have the goal of writing a book themselves. So last month we did a wonderful interview with Will Haygood, the author of a forthcoming book about Thurgood Marshall, the former Supreme Court Justice. And Will, of course, is the author of biographies about Anna Clayton Powell, Sammy Davis Jr., and Sugar Ray Robinson. And tonight we're going to talk to Aaliyah Bundles, an old buddy, an old friend. And Aaliyah, of course, is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, who needs no introduction, I'm sure, to this audience, and the granddaughter of Aaliyah Walker, her namesake. And of course, Aaliyah did a wonderful biography of her great-great-grandmother several years ago called On Her Own Ground, and it was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. It was a Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, and I remember reading that book and I said, when is the movie? Please make a movie of this. If there was any justice in the world, the movie would have been made by now. And so Aaliyah now is working on a book about her grandmother, Aaliyah Walker, and I thought it'd be really cool to talk about the process of writing this book, and also about legacy, about growing up as a child with this legacy of achievement and distinction. After a 30-year career as an executive and Emmy Award-winning producer with ABC and NBC News, Aaliyah now serves on several nonprofit boards and is president of the Madam Walker, Aaliyah Walker Family Archives. Let's welcome Aaliyah Bundles. And I wanted to start with, I think the most obvious question is, what was it like to grow up as a great-great-granddaughter of Madam J. Walker and the granddaughter of Aaliyah Walker, who was this larger-than-life figure in the Harlem Renaissance, this woman who was a major socialite, who turns up as a figure in all these novels, I mean, what was it like to grow up in that family? And are the books that you're writing, was this your literary destiny?
Right. Well, I grew up in a household where I was surrounded by things that had belonged to Madam Walker and Aaliyah Walker. The silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram, and the china that we used on special occasions had belonged to Madam Walker. The baby grand piano on which I learned to read music had been Aaliyah Walker's piano, and my mother was vice president of the Madam Walker manufacturing company. So, it could have been a little bit overwhelming, but my mother was the fourth generation of women in her family to have been an executive at the Walker Company. She went to Howard, she majored in business and chemistry because it was understood that that's what she would do. And she didn't want my brothers and me to feel that we had an obligation to follow in those footsteps. And really by that time, the Walker Company was declining, was in the 50s. It's funny, kids say to me, did you know Madam Walker? And I'm like, I'm old, but I'm not that old. She died in 1919, but anyway, by the 50s, the company was really declining because some of the original people who had worked for the company were still there. They weren't keeping up with the times. And my dad actually worked for the company for a short period of time after my parents were married, and then was hired away to become president of another black hair care company called Summit Laboratories. So yes, I grew up with this, but my mother was wise enough to say, follow your own path and follow your own dreams, and my passion was writing. At 8 years old, I had a little short story that was published in a little magazine, and I got really excited when I wrote, and so that was the path that I followed. And just to tell you how I because I was kind of ambivalent about Madam Walker. I was more excited about Aaliyah Walker. In my senior year in high school, I went to a predominantly white school, about 4% black, but I really wanted a black studies course, and I was pushing for that, and I didn't get that. But in a humanities class, I wrote about Aaliyah Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. But it was also a period of afros, and Madam Walker, people said, oh, she invented the hot comb, and I later found out that wasn't true. I was really not trying to do Madam Walker at that point, and had to sort of come to an understanding of who she really was in her politics. But Aaliyah Walker was more fascinating to me. And then when I was in graduate school at Columbia, which Marita also went to, my advisor was Phil Garland, the only black woman on the faculty. And during our conversation about my master's paper, I gave Phil these really cliche topics, and at the end of the conversation, she said, your name is Aaliyah. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Aaliyah Walker? And I'm like, yeah, it's my family. I mean, I really wanted to have my own thing. And Phil said to me, that's what you're going to write about. And that was, many years ago.
Now, as I said, we all know, who Madam J. Walker was, even though in reading your book, it was really interesting to find out, to puncture some of the myths. Like, she really wasn't a millionaire. She was the first woman to make, I think, $750,000.
So I've now changed that.
Oh, really?
You write these things, and you do your research, and then you discover things that aren't exactly what you thought. And I did, when I wrote the book, I really was trying to be really, really accurate. And her estate was worth $700,000, so I said she wasn't quite a millionaire. But then a friend of mine who really does a lot of corporate history said, what she really was, because the value of the company was more. So now I've revised that. But that's what you do when you write history.
Right. And she was, so involved in the politics of the time, and she supported so many important political movements. So there was all this new information about Madam J. Walker, C.J. Walker. Who was Aaliyah, and why are you writing a book about it?
When I started the other book, I really thought I was doing a kind of double biography about mother and daughter, and I realized that these two women really needed their own books, that they were really so different, and that Aaliyah Walker had always really been overshadowed by her mother. In fact, I feel compelled to write about her because now she's always mentioned, but it's always the same two paragraphs that aren't really quite accurate. The sort of meme is, Madam Walker made the money, Aaliyah Walker spent the money. She had parties, she squandered it. It's so much more complicated than that. She's so much more interesting than that. But in On Her Own Ground, I tried to develop the relationship between the two women. because it was a very complex relationship. But what I realized in doing the research for this book is that even more than I realized when I was writing On Her Own Ground, Aaliyah Walker was really so important to the social scene and to what was going on in the cultural scene, that I knew she'd been considered a patron of the arts. I really know that she was so much more involved in theater and music, with the musicians, with the friendships with actors and actresses, than I really understood when I wrote the other book. I knew that, she knew Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Countee Cullen. I couldn't find, when I was doing the other book, really close relationships with them. I mean, they were there, they were on the scene. Langston Hughes called her the Joy Goddess of Harlem's 1920s, hence the name of the new book, Joy Goddess. But what I began to realize while doing this research is that set of writers, they were 15 years or so younger than she. So they weren't her close buddies. Her close buddies were the actors and musicians. So people like James Reese Europe and Burt Williams and Ada Overton Walker. That it was that slightly older generation who were the same age as she. And that's really informed the themes of the new book.
What was it like to be the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker? The pluses and the minuses, and how did she have to, like you wanted to prove yourself in a particular way. How did she have to prove herself?
Well, who's ever had the first black woman, self-made millionaire, driven as their mother? She invented the role of black heiress. There were other people. Mary Church Terrell, who some of you who know women's history, her father was Robert Church in Memphis. He was a millionaire. So she was, in fact, the daughter of a black millionaire, but her parents were, estranged, and she grew up, her childhood was, she wasn't the sort of flamboyance that came along with Madam Walker's wealth, because Madam Walker's wealth came later in life, and she went from washerwoman at 38 to a really wealthy woman within a few years after that, after she started selling her products. Aaliyah was already grown when her mother started making a lot of money, but she benefited from that. So she started out working in the company. She was very involved, but they were, Madam Walker was that self-made first generation person. I'm really the only one who knows how to do it right. And when Aaliyah would try to run her New York office and do her own thing, her mother was interfering with it. Sometimes she was like, oh, you're doing a great job, and then, the next week she might say, I don't like what you're doing. And so there was always that tension where Aaliyah would feel like, I want to have my own, I have my own ideas, and maybe I should just go off and do my own things. Harlem Renaissance, that the 1920s is when everything really jumped off. It's really sort of starting kind of 1911, 12, 13, think people are really moving there. And so she's one of the first people to buy a house, first black people to buy a house. And she has it designed by Bertner Tandy, who's one of the founders of the Alphas and the first licensed black architect in New York. And her mother has hosted parties for her in Indianapolis when she comes to visit. But the first chapter of my book opens with a party that she's hosting for her mother. And these women go all out. It's always the best of everything. In fact, maybe I'll read a little bit of that. But it's the best musicians, the best food, the best flowers, all of that. They love to really, have the best of everything and entertain people, introduce people to new artists and musicians, and the best conversations. So it's, both of them really loved that idea of entertaining on a grand scale. And I've mentioned two other things. Her parties were legend. Eventually in 1927 is when she opens the Dark Tower. But the wedding that she had for my grandmother, they called the $1 million wedding. It didn't cost $1 million, but to someone my grandmother did not want to marry, but it was a grand wedding. She was an impresario.
Precursor Star Jones.
Yeah, oh God.
I gotta ask.
Not quite like that. But.
I gotta ask.
Kennedy, and her mother preferred Dr. Kennedy, who was more of the do-right guy, and of course Dr. Wiley Wilson was more of the bad boy. Long story but she, she was sort of torn between the two, and they came to to Howard's homecoming, Thanksgiving of 1918, when Wiley was here in medical school. He was already a pharmacist. And it became clear that this was serious, and Madam was not happy. So over the next few months, she was going back and forth between the two, and her mother gets sick in early 1919. She and Aaliyah kind of had a big fight, and Aaliyah and my grandmother had gone off to Panama and Cuba on a sales trip, and they get word that Madam is ill and not going to recover, and so there's the last letter that Madam writes to Aaliyah in early May of 1919, and in the letter she says, "I'm so glad that you have decided to marry Kennedy and not Wiley Wilson. I never thought he was right for you. You and Kennedy may go to, you go to Europe and let him study," because he was interested in studying psychiatry, because he'd been in Europe during World War I and he'd seen a lot of the psychological, what we now call post-traumatic stress. You may have your chateau, I will join you there. And then she goes on, and at the end she says, "I never want you to be this far away from me again. Love and kisses, Mother." So this is like May 15th or so. And Aaliyah has apparently told her she's going to marry Kennedy, to make her mother happy. So about a week later, Madam dies. Aaliyah rushes back, tries to get back. The funeral happens the day before she can get back, through no fault of her own, but because you just can't get on a plane and fly, because that didn't exist. And her mother's funeral is May 30th. She gets back to New York on May 31st. Kennedy meets her at Grand Central Terminal. And he's long separated from a previous wife, but not divorced. Aaliyah is really, frantic about her mother's death, obviously. And 3 days later, she buries her mother in a little private ceremony at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And 3 days after that, on June 6th, her 34th birthday, she marries Dr. Wiley Wilson.
Well, there's one more.
Oh, then there's one more. So she marries the dashing Dr. Wiley Wilson, and there's a whole backstory on him. But he proceeds to very quickly rekindle a relationship with Inez Richardson, a young, pretty little thing. Embarrasses Aaliyah. It's really heartbreaking. And what her mother said, everything her mother said.
Yeah.
So they separate, and she goes off to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East to sort of get him out of her head. And while she's away, Kennedy starts writing her letters. And actually, in one of these notebooks, I have all of his letters to her while she's away. And he's saying to her, "May the path of your return be strewn with 1,000,000 rose petals." So he's really putting up, because he's promised her mother on her deathbed that he's going to do the right thing. So finally she and Wiley get a divorce, and then she and Kennedy marry. But by this time, Kennedy is trying to be the good guy that he is. And he has taken a job in Tuskegee as the number 2 at the Veterans Hospital, because Madam's doctor, Dr. Joseph Ward, becomes the head of the Veterans Hospital, not the Tuskegee Hospital, not the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment Hospital, different, the Veterans Hospital. And he sort of moves to Tuskegee, and it's now, 1926, 27, and she is not moving to Tuskegee. She goes to visit a couple of times, but she is not going to be staying in faculty housing when she could be in Harlem. Yeah. So they divorced, shortly before she dies in 31.
Now, before I ask you to read that, the section that you do want to read, can you talk specifically about how she nurtured Black artists? That is, okay, the parties are one thing, but how did her support actually, really manifest in her?
Well, on several different levels. One of the new things that I learned is that 2 people actually lived in her house. She had this, wonderful townhouse, And Taylor Gordon, who was a very famous singer during that period of time, who performed with James Rosamond Johnson, both here and in Europe, actually lived at the house for a while. She, because it was a big townhouse, there were a couple of apartments in it. And then, oh gosh, what's his name? Who wrote Tropic Death? He was Eric Walren. Eric Walren, who was one of the greatest writers of the Harlem Renaissance, but whose name is not very well known, actually lived there for a while. So she provided free rent. And then while they were working. And then Edna Thomas, who was a very famous actress during that period of time, who later was in Streetcar Named Desire and who was one of the Lafayette Players, had been a social secretary for Madam Walker and was one of Aaliyah's good friends. And she and her husband lived in the house. Her husband was sort of the manager of the building, but for a long time they lived there. So that made it meant she could do her work as an actress. And then there were just other people who wanted, who knew that if she mentioned them, that they would get a lot of attention. There's some letters where Langston Hughes is, I'm trying to remember who he's writing to, but he sends a book to her as a gift, and then she mentions it, and then Jerry Major and Bessie Bearden, Romery Bearden's mother, who was a society columnist, write about her getting the book, or that she came to the party so she could give them publicity.
Right. She was the major connector.
Right.
Great. You want to read that?
Sure. So there are two things I'm going to read. One is just the beginning of the first chapter, which is about this dinner party in 1913, and just the value of black newspapers. They're talking about the process. This book has taken me so much longer than I thought. I left my good paying job 6 years ago thinking that I would be finished with this in 3 years, and the research just took me a lot longer. And it's all good, but I do need to get finished so I can get the rest of my advance.
Did you have to go to Paris and?
I did go to Paris and London. I had a speech in London, so I parlayed that into a little bit of research, and went to those places. But a lot of traveling around.
Walked in her footsteps.
Walked in her footsteps, exactly. But it's the thing that sort of took longer, and I didn't get to go to Addis and Cairo and Rome, where she also went, and Monte Carlo, because not yet. But maybe the next book will be My Eat, Pray, Love, following Aaliyah Walker's footsteps in all of those places. But it was sort of this new access to all of these black newspapers online through ProQuest. I can now sit in my my pajamas at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep and go online and see 10 black newspapers, including the Baltimore Afro as early as 1892. So there, these women were in the paper every week. So there's a lot of things. And I came across this an article from the Baltimore Afro-American in October 1914 describing a dinner party that when Aaliyah was trying to persuade her mother to move to Harlem. And I thought, oh my God, this is my first chapter. So I'll read a little bit from that. Only the best of everything would do. Only the Tiffany silver and the monogrammed linen. Only the florist's most fragrant bouquets and the butcher's most selective cuts. Only the finest musicians, and of course, only the most interesting guests. Aaliyah Walker Robinson knew her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, better than anyone else ever could or would. Better than their dozens of grateful employees. Better than the hundreds of people who departed her mother's lectures inspired to change their lives. Better than the thousands of women who swore by the healing ointment in those shiny goldenrod tins of Walker's wonderful hair grower. Aaliyah knew exactly what made Madam happy and what could snap her temper. After 29 years as her mother's only child, she knew who had broken her heart when she was still just a poor washerwoman named Sarah Breedlove, and who had comforted her when there was no reward in doing so. Now that she was campaigning to speed up her mother's move to Harlem, she was determined to make this dinner the most impressive gathering she ever had hosted. On this October 1914 evening, only the best of everything for her mother would do, because not so many years ago, they had had the worst of everything, and sometimes they had had nothing at all.
That's very good.
That's great. That's great.
Now I want to open up questions from the audience. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, Aaliyah?
Always have to raise mine.
Go ahead, go ahead.
You mentioned briefly how you want to get on with this. Who's your publisher in this venture? And how did the contract?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Who that I wanted to get this done so I can get the rest of the advance, and who's my publisher and how did that come about? My publisher is Scribner, who was my publisher for my other book, for On Her Own Ground. And when we were looking for, when I was doing the book proposal, my agent, Gail Ross, who lives in Washington, and I thought about going to other places, but the publishing industry has changed so much. But we also thought it made sense to stay with the same publisher because it meant that On Her Own Ground would get some sort of cross promotion with this, and that it's sort of a 1-2 hit, and it really made sense to do it that way. I met Gail because after I'd written my young adult book, I wanted to do the bigger book, and a friend of mine
Your young adult book
about Madam Walker, right? A friend of mine introduced me to Gail. And at that point, people thought, "Oh, your agent has to be in New York." But Gail has really made a real sort of cottage industry of Washington writers, because there's so many. Gail Ross, because she does nonfiction and mostly current events and political things. But even more than getting that advance, which I do need because I need to finish it and figure out the next chapter of my life. Right now, I'm really trying to kill Madam Walker. I mean, and you understand this, not kill her, but I need to get past her life in the writing. I have this sort of, yeah, right. I know that was provocative, but right now I have, I don't know, 800 or 900 single-spaced pages of a chronology, really, really detailed chronology. But it's the only way I know to organize this material, because I have 2 rows of research.
Both of their lives?
No, this is just this book. But
Aaliyah.
Yeah, just Aaliyah. But it's I'm compulsive and it's kind of overkill. But I knew that I would never remember everything. So I start off with their childhood, with every quotation and excerpt from letter and excerpt from article, because I don't know how else I would remember it. I go back and read that. I mean, that's sort of the skeleton of what I'm doing, and then I go back and then I polish it and try to make poetry out of these, sort of dry facts. But when I go back and read it, I'm like, oh, I've totally forgotten that, but that's really important. But I'm at the point now where I really want to get past Madam Walker, and I really want to get into just Aaliyah's life. So that's why I say I'm ready for Madam to die so I can move on.
Yes, Juliet.
Thank you very much for this. I wanted to, since this was such an important period and she was so engaged with so many writers and other people, how much did you have to go into research about some of these other people to learn about her? Maybe you already talked about that.
Okay, the question was, how much research did Aaliyah have to do about the other writers who Aaliyah Walker impacted?
A ton, which is another of my excuses for why this is taking me so long, and especially because I had to do the theater people and the musicians, and there's much more written about the literary people, and so because they left writings.
Yeah.
But I really had to sort of teach myself music. I mean, I knew she knew James Reese Europe was their preferred band leader. I mean, he played in all the Fifth Avenue mansions and Palm Beach and Newport. He was really the man. But he was good friends with him, so I knew about that. And there has been a biography of him, so that was helpful. But and I knew she knew James Rosamond Johnson and James Weldon James
James
Weldon Johnson, but his
Johnson
brother is
and
John
John
Rosamond
Rosamond.
Johnson. But I always get the J's mixed up. But I had to then do research on them. Ada Overton Walker, you know, Walker and Williams, Burt Williams, George Walker, they were the big vaudeville guys. Well, Ada Overton Walker, George Walker's wife, you know, I knew she was on the scene, but then I realized I had to learn about her, and she is in this first chapter because she has died like a week before this dinner party. So in order to, and James Reese Europe, who's at this dinner party, was one of the pallbearers at her funeral and was the person who performed with her. So then I had to do the research on her.
So in order really to make all this very dramatic, that one scene, you have to know a lot about the characters there and the mindset. So it's almost like writing a novel.
Right. It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I
Yeah.
want it to
Yeah.
be like, you know, like a novel. I'm trying to write poetry. I'm making the bar really high. But
Yeah, I can see. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there the fear? Yes, you did it the first time. Is there the fear? What is the fear this time?
Yeah, I
Coming,
think
you know, on an
it's-
even bigger level. You set the stakes higher for yourself. What is
yeah,
the
no,
fear?
that's so absolutely true. You know, with Madam Walker's story in some ways was a slam dunk. I mean, yes, I found a lot of new material, and I was able to burst a lot of myths and make her a more multidimensional person than other people realized she was. That it wasn't just the hair thing; it was her political involvement and arts patronage and philanthropy, and you know. But that was kind of a, you know, even though she wasn't born in slavery, but it was sort of an up from slavery because she was born in the same plantation where her parents had been enslaved, and she died a millionaire in a mansion. So that was kind of, you know, you knew what the arc of the story was. Aaliyah's story is more complicated for me because I have to do that. She's not really the, you know, total spendthrift and screw up that some people think she was. People sort of haven't, not as many people have heard of her. I mean, it's still a lot of people don't know who Madam Walker is, but not as many people are familiar with her. What they know is, you know, is pretty sketchy, but she's really fascinating. So now I'm trying to excavate this and figure out how I can, you know, make her relevant to people.
Well, you sort of hit on, you use the phrase dramatic arc. You know, well, what is the dramatic arc of her life? I mean, you know, as a woman, as a socialite, what's, you know, like they say in Hollywood, if you pitch, you know, give me this in, you know, in 3 sentences, and as I can we'll make a movie. What's the dramatic arc of her story?
You know, it's the story of the daughter of a larger than life person who is struggling to find her own identity, and she finds it as a patron of the arts. But it's, you know, and it's in a really amazing time, and then because it's the 20s and it's Prohibition, and then when it looks like it's going to end, when the good times are going to end, she's ready to check out.
You mean literally?
Yeah, and she does. I mean, it's sort of, you know, it's almost, it's just really amazing to me. My grandfather said, there's a film, $2 in a Dream, that Stanley Nelson did.
Right.
And, you know, Stanley is the grandson of Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom. And many of you know Jill Nelson, his sister, who narrated $2 in a Dream, and they're very good friends of mine. Their cousin grew up 2 doors down from me, so, you know, our families have known each other for several generations. But my grandfather, who was 90 at the time, was interviewed in $2 in a Dream, and he was great in this, and he said, Aaliyah Walker knocked herself out because she wanted to be knocked out. Now those were his words, and he said that because, you know, she was born in 1885. Her mother was a washerwoman until she was a teenager, so they grew up really poor in St. Louis. And then by the time, then her mother was able to send her off to Knoxville College for a year, but by that point, there had been so much turmoil in their lives with the, you know, her mother's second husband, who was kind of a drunk and, you know, beat her mother up, and it was, you know, really rough. So but it was her mother's dream that she become educated. So she went off to Knoxville College, and she really could not fit in this kind of very, you know, earnest, pious environment. She was a big city girl, and was, sort of going through life trying to please her mother, and this wasn't really, wasn't really working. So this is when the conflict between the two of them began to become established. So that by the time she is on her own, the conflicts are already there. Now, remind me what the question was. The arc. Okay. So why she knocked herself out was where I was going with this. She'd been poor, and now they're rich. They've got everything. And the 20s come, and she's still enjoying herself and having great parties, and then the market crashes.
Yeah.
So the sales that had been, $250,000, which was a whole lot of money then, were by 1930, $30,000 a year. They had just built a new building in Indianapolis that was several $100,000. Thank goodness that building was built, because it's now a National Historic Landmark, as is the house in Westchester. But now there's no money coming in. Now, she was living large, but she didn't spend all the money. As everybody said, the building took a lot of the money. The upkeep of the house took a lot of money. She had had a stroke a few years earlier, though she recovered from it. But, her doctor was saying, you have to slow down, you can't do this, you can't eat that, and she didn't want to stop doing that. She didn't want to stop partying, and so she was still entertaining people. That was what her life had become. People had this expectation. She would write to her, to the attorney, and said, I have to live at a certain level because that's what people expect of me. And so she had all of this pressure. And when she could see that, the money was not coming in, in August of 1931, she had just divorced Kennedy. Money's not coming in, and she was invited to a birthday party in Long Branch, New Jersey. Her friend May Fain, and so she and a few friends from the city drive down to Long Branch, which Long Branch was sort of the Martha's Vineyard of of that era. That's where presidents went. But there's always a little black community at all of these resorts, because somebody has to do the work, and so there's always a black community. So they go down there. They have this great birthday party for May Fain. They're on the beach, and they have lobster and chocolate cake and champagne. And then she goes back to her cottage that evening and has a stroke and dies. Mm-hmm. So that's why my grandfather said she knocked herself out, because she wanted to be knocked out. She just could not fathom being poor again, because she had been poor. She knew what that was about. She did not want to do that.
So the philanthropy and the arts patronage really satisfied her in a way. Would you say that maybe her marriages didn't, that nothing else did, that she really found her identity and everything through that?
Yeah, she really enjoyed being surrounded by musicians and artists, and she would say, I've got to be this is the theater season. She might have gone to Tuskegee to spend a few weeks with Kennedy, but I've got to get back to New York. She really enjoyed being around people, and it was one party after another, and it's just amazing to me. I don't know how these people got anything else done, but you read, but seriously, because it was the liquor was not. Sometimes when you didn't know what was in it, people would there's Carl Van Vechten has these. He kept the day books, diaries, and she's often mentioned in those, and so you read through that, and he's like drunk all this day, but then he goes and writes, he writes the next chapter for his novel. I don't know how he did it, but also Bessie Bearden and Jerry Major, every week they're writing these society columns, and Aaliyah's at this party, and this is what they had on, and they went from this one to that one, and they were up until 5 o'clock, and then they were at work the next day. But it gives me this really amazing sense of what was going on, and I think what I'm trying to do, lots and lots of people have written about the Harlem Renaissance, but I don't think that I've seen anything that focuses as much on the social scene as I'm trying to do. And I think maybe in some ways people they think it's a little frivolous, and so we don't want to do the social scene, but the social scene tells you so much about what's going on.
And in fact, the social scene is where the major deals are done, the major connections are made, those big parties. Yeah, the lady in the back there.
Thank you so much for this book. I'm so excited. I can't wait to read it. I was just wondering if you can speak to the legacy that you feel she's leaving.
Good question.
And my second question, My grandmother came up during the Harlem Renaissance. She was just an ordinary woman from St. Kitts, but she was a classically trained pianist. She was a student of Juilliard before Juilliard was an official college. And I really want to write that story. And I just, so I just wanted to ask you any recommendations that you have for me.
Great. Are you familiar with Rosalind Story, who's written about the black opera singers? Her book may be here. But it's Rosalind Story, and I can't think of the they're black. She did a novel more recently, right? But and it's, I don't know, it might be Black Divas or Black Pearls or something like that. But Rosalind Story. But there, people have done research on classically trained musicians from the period. And when you mention this, I think there's somebody that I ran across who was from the West Indies who played at one of Aaliyah Walker's parties. It could have been your grandmother. I don't know. But if you haven't done,
Because she used to talk about the salon. Mm-hmm. I mean, but she wasn't anyone famous, but
right.
She was a part of that community.
Well, and if you haven't had a chance to look at the ProQuest Black Historical Newspapers database, and you can, if you have a DC Public Library, you can access this online. You just need your library membership number. And the DC Public Library database only has maybe 4 or 5 of the black newspapers. I use the one at Columbia, which has 10, but most universities will have more, and it depends on how much money they pay for the subscription. But I would really recommend ProQuest Black Historical Newspapers database, and it's like Googling history. You put a name in and you'd be stunned at what comes up. But in terms of Aaliyah Walker's legacy, I mean, I think during her lifetime, people knew that she commissioned photographers to do, some of the most famous black photographers took her picture, wanted to make sure that they did her picture. They painted her or sculpted her. Richmond Barté painted her, sculpted her. Augusta Savage. R.E. Mercer, who's a name many people don't know, was a famous photographer of the era. Addison Scurlock took both of them. And there are a couple of Vanderzees of Aaliyah. Not so much a portrait, but Scurlock seems to have done more of her. In fact, it's interesting. I think it's Jerry Major said that they really didn't know Vanderzee. That he was doing more everyday people. It's an interesting thing that there were some other photographers who were sort of doing more of the famous people portraits. And it's an interesting thing. So Vanderzee sort of emerged a little bit later in their telling of it. Even Bernice Abbott did a couple of portraits of Aaliyah Walker and writes about what that was like. So she was somebody who, to have her endorsement was really very important. She did art exhibits at her townhouse. So people really wanted to be a part of it. So I'm thinking, who are the people now who do the same kind of thing? People like Bernard Kinsey and his wife, who have this fabulous art collection in Los Angeles. But there are people who do it, or, Peggy Cooper K-Fritz, people who really promote artists. Or Marita Golden, who really is the godmother for many writers, But it's the same kind of thing.
Juliet again, you mentioned letters. Did she leave a large body of letters? And did you do journals?
No journals, unfortunately. But yes, a lot of letters. I'm really very fortunate. Most of the letters that I have are to Mr. Ransom, the attorney. So she's not telling him everything that's going on because he's looking askance at some of the things that she's doing. He reads about her in the newspaper and thinks that she's not serious enough. But I can also tell from letters that other people write, like Harold Jackman's letters to Count Cullen, where he's talking about being at her parties, or things that Langston Hughes wrote, or things that Van Vechten wrote. I can sort of get a sense of it. And then these weekly society columns tell me a little bit about what's going on.
I got that, but it was her
personal letters. Yeah, I mean, and every now and then, she'll sort of confide. She'll confide in Mr. Ransom when she's feeling depressed and feeling alone. There's also a little body of letters that she wrote to Carl Van Vechten, which are at the library in the Beinecke collection at Yale, where she's talking about, where people think, oh, Van Vechten, isn't he just sort of the white guy who's exploiting people? But he was much more of a friend to her, and somebody she confided in, because he didn't want anything from her. He didn't have to have his hand out, and so she felt comfortable talking to him.
The lady in back of Juliet.
I know some of the names you're saying, but I think a lot of people here know all the names you're saying. I don't. As an adult, was she involved with the church at all? Was the church part of this large arts community, or was there antagonism with her wild life and the church's serious life?
That's a good question. I don't think she was going to church very often. You're right. She grew up in the church, and she knew the church. She grew up in the church. And when she, when she got married to Wiley, she got married at St. James Presbyterian, because she got involved. When she went to Knoxville was a Presbyterian church. When my grandmother got married, it was in the Grand St. Philip's Episcopal Church, because that was the church to have a wedding in Harlem. But she wasn't really going to church. And it's some of my research. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was the minister at her funeral, which was really in a famous funeral home in Harlem. But he was really a straight-laced guy. When you look at his son, his son was the opposite of that. But some of this early research I'm doing about blacks moving to Harlem, he is no drinking, no, none of these bad things that people should be doing. So she was, right, no music, right, exactly. And that's part of this chapter that I'm writing about. This dinner party is, this sort of, it's really like now. It's like the rap music thing versus the not rap music thing.
Yeah.
And right, exactly. And it was like, oh, that ragtime stuff is, they're dancing. They shouldn't be dancing, and people like Ada Overton Walker were trying to dignify the dance, and Madam and Aaliyah were in, along with that camp, even though Madam had a foot in both camps.
The lady behind, yeah.
This is such a really interesting story, but very sad that I was sort of figuring 45, that was gone. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I have a question for you about the sort of the publishing part of it. Is Scribner going to support you as far as, telling this story to a wider group, or
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope not to be segregated in there.
Well,
but this whole thing is so different now.
Yeah.
To be in a bookstore right now is really incredible. I'm sort of preparing myself to figure out how to sign e-books. There's some app that allows you to.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I know exactly. So I think it's gonna be very different. It's a really different scene now. My other book is 10 years ago, which is really a long time. But I was really lucky the last time around. Because I worked in journalism, I knew a lot of people, and I kind of got, all the things that you could get. The Today Show and CBS Sunday Morning and NPR, Fresh Air. I got a New York Times Book Review, New Yorker. Just really, really lucky. This time around, it's really different because there aren't as many bookstores. They aren't really sending you on tours.
There aren't as many reviewers of books.
Exactly, not as many. That's right. There were all the book reviews. They're not,
Not as many readers.
Not right.
Well,
but
I think the readers are there, but that's another discussion. Yeah. The lady in the back in the brown.
Well, hello, Miss Aaliyah.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. I just wanted to say that this is all so intriguing to me, and I love that you are sharing this journey. I totally admire you as an empowered woman, and I guess my question would be, in sharing this legacy and sharing this journey, what impact do you want this to have on the younger generation? Because we have a generation of lost girls who believe that their bodies is what has to make them who they are. But your story and even your family's legacy tell us something different. What impact do you personally hope that this book and the previous book are making on the younger generation.
But let me just first say thank you so much for coming. And this is the power of social media.
Yes.
You know, I know that a few people are here, and I thank you for coming. We met each other through Facebook. You know, the body image thing, Marita and I were talking earlier about hair and, you know, what people feel compelled to do with their hair, and, you know, when girls see, they think they have to be Rihanna or they have to be Beyonce, both physically and with hair. And I don't know. Marita, I'm not the hair police, and so, you know, I try not to judge folks about the choices that they make, but I think it's a tyranny, and it's sort of heartbreaking to me, you know, as a woman of a certain age who thought that we, we thought we went through this, and this generation, it's like it's worse now. You know, when we would complain, there were no images of us. Now the images that we can't possibly live up to. What do you say?
The gentleman here. I mean, this is really great. I'm so glad that we're having this wonderful conversation. Yeah.
As the chief researcher and also a generational member of the family, what is your relationship with the other members of the family?
You know, I'm really lucky. I have nobody bothering me. I have, you know, it's a really small family. I have two brothers. My grandmother actually was adopted by Aaliyah Walker. Aaliyah Walker was married 3 times and had no children. And it's a longer story than than I'll talk about in the book, but my grandmother was, her grandmother lived across the alley from Madam Walker's factory and office in Indianapolis. And she and her siblings would come visit their grandmother. Their mother was widowed, and their mother was the 3rd generation of women in her family to be widowed in her 30s with 7 or 8 children. And my grandmother and her sisters had really long hair because it was sort of a combination of Native American, African American, and European background. Their family had been free people of color in North Carolina in the 1700s. 2 of her great-great-something grandfathers had been in the Revolutionary War. And they, as free people of color in North Carolina in the 1830s, they were chased out of the state and moved to Indiana. And so they were free people of color, but poor. So my grandmother's long braids were perfect for her to be a model for Madam Walker, and because her main product was Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. Right. And the Walker women, so
Aaliyah
adopted my grandmother. And so there were other young people, men, boys and girls, young musicians who they sponsored, but they adopted my grandmother. And there's a complicated story that I sort of discovered through this, is that I think that one of Aaliyah Walker's teachers actually lived next door to one of my grandmother's biological mother's brothers in St. Louis. So I think there was some connection pre all of this stuff, and that was how the connection was made. But so my grandmother was married twice and had 1 child with each marriage. My mother was the child of her 2nd marriage, and there were only 3 of us, so there wasn't really a big family. Madam Walker had a number of siblings, but those siblings didn't have very many children, and they had girls who didn't have children. So the family is really small. So I'm really glad to not have, somebody saying you can't tell this, because I do have friends who are writing stories about their families who have cousins and siblings who don't agree, and it's not fun.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, let's give Aaliyah a hand. This is wonderful. This is really wonderful. And just a couple of things. I just want to find out, how did you all find out about tonight's program? Was it the Washington Post?
I saw it in the post.
Okay. Was it an email from the Hurston Wright Foundation? Okay, an email from Sankofa? Okay, we've got to get you on Sankofa's list. An email from me? Okay.
You hit me both ways.
Yeah, I hit you both ways. Okay, great. So our Facebook, yeah. Any tweets in the room?
Right.
And you know, the lady who mentioned, you know, you want to write about your family member. Well, you need to attend the Hurston Writers Week next summer. I want to talk for a minute about the foundation. On Thursday, November 10th, we're having once again our annual Legacy Award ceremony. And this is our annual literary gala, where every year we honor the best Black writing in, you know, fiction, nonfiction poetry, as well as honor distinguished Black writers. This year we're going to honor Imamu Baraka, who's actually going to come to accept his North Star Award. And the event is taking place on Thursday, November 10th at the Oxon Hill Manor, out near the National Harbor. And if you would like to get tickets, which I hope you do, you can simply go to the Hurston Wright website, hurstonwright.org, and find out about everything we're doing. Our next program in this series won't be until January, and that's going to be another great discussion. Lynn Duke, who is a former writer for the Washington Post, and who's the author of the book Mandela, Mobutu, and Me, about her time as a foreign correspondent in Africa, is doing a book called The Baroness. And it's about a mixed-race African woman in Portugal who was a slave trader, and how she was this incredible slave trader during the time when the transatlantic slave trade was, you know, at its height. And she's this, talking about larger-than-life figures. She found out about her, she was doing some research, and her research was taking her to Lisbon, Portugal. It's just an incredible story. So when she told me about that, I said, oh, we want to get you on the program too. So, but you'll be getting information about that. That'll be January 18th. So once again, thank you all. Do we have any, you're free to buy any of the books here.
Right.
I hope you
Buy
some books. You know, maybe, I'm not sure if Aaliyah is here, but, and I hope to see some of you at the Legacy Award dinner on the 10th.
It's a great
Thank
ceremony.
you.
Thank you.
Let's have another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And intimate enough to have a nice conversation. If you have not signed our email list, please do. We only send out one book email per week, and you can be kept aware of what's going on at Sankofa. And I also want to let you know that we have a small gallery that's emerging here at Sankofa. It's an art gallery. If you go out this door and come around, you'll see it here in the back of the building. And it's for local artists, international artists, known artists, unknown artists, who post original works there for several weeks, and they are for sale as well. Sankofa is hosting a number of events coming up in November and December. One is going to be a very wonderful children's book fair. It's called the Magical Mirrors Children's Book Fair in December for a whole week. And that's from December 5th is the beginning date, and then 9 days from then it ends. And the whole space is full of wonderful children's books and children's activities. So we hope you'll stop by again for that. And our sister is here. Our sisters both are here in town. We look forward to seeing them back again, especially with the arrival of the new publication about Aaliyah bundles. So thank you once again. We hope to see you.